The winter sun was just beginning to rise over San Francisco International Airport as a tall, distinguished-looking man in his mid-40s made his way through the terminal. He walked with quiet confidence, pulling a simple black carry-on suitcase. Despite being worth over $3 billion, he dressed like any other comfortable traveler. Dark jeans, a well-worn black sweater, and leather loafers that had seen better days. As the founder of one of Silicon Valley's most innovative AI companies, he preferred keeping a low profile. No flashy watches, no designer labels screaming for attention. His mother had always taught him that true class wasn't about what you wore, but how you carried yourself. That lesson had served him well throughout his journey from a small apartment in Oakland to the boardrooms of tech giants. The first-class lounge was relatively quiet that morning. He settled into a corner seat, pulling out his tablet to review some documents before the flight. A group of business people nearby were having an animated discussion about cryptocurrency, their voices carrying across the room. He smiled to himself, remembering his early days of pitching to investors who thought his ideas about artificial intelligence were too ambitious. His phone buzzed. A message from his daughter about her college application results coming later that week. He texted back a quick encouraging note, his heart warming at how she was following her own path into marine biology, completely different from his tech world. Family always came first for him, something money hadn't changed. When boarding was announced, he waited patiently in line, observing his fellow travelers. There was a young mother trying to calm her crying baby, an elderly couple helping each other with their bags, and a teenager excitedly heading off for what looked like their first solo trip. He loved these small moments of human connection, the tiny stories playing out in public spaces. The boarding process was smooth until he reached the plane's entrance. The flight attendant at the door glanced at his boarding pass, then at him, then back at the pass. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, and something in her expression shifted. It was a look he knew well, that subtle mix of doubt and judgment he'd faced countless times before his success became public knowledge. He took his seat in 2A, placing his carry-on in the overhead compartment and settling in with a book he'd been meaning to read for months. Around him, other first-class passengers were being greeted warmly, offered pre-flight drinks, and treated with the expected courtesy of premium cabin service. He noticed how the same flight attendant who had questioned his boarding pass was all smiles with the other passengers, her voice warm and welcoming with them. As he sat there, he thought about how success hadn't insulated him from these moments. If anything, they reminded him why his company's charitable foundation focused so heavily on education and equal opportunity. He believed in letting actions speak louder than words, in changing minds through example rather than confrontation. The cabin crew began their final preparations for takeoff. Outside his window, ground crew members were finishing their duties, their fluorescent vests bright against the morning sky. He took a deep breath, centering himself for what would turn out to be a very unexpected flight to New York. The flight was preparing for takeoff when the first real sign of trouble began. The same flight attendant who had given him that doubtful look at boarding was now making her way through first class, checking seatbelts and overhead compartments. She seemed to make a point of double and triple checking his seat assignment, despite having already verified it at the door. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of authority that wasn't present when she spoke to other passengers. Several nearby travelers looked up from their phones and magazines, curious about the repeated questioning. He reached for his phone, pulling up the digital boarding pass he'd already shown twice before. "Of course," he replied calmly, holding it up for her to see. Years of dealing with similar situations had taught him that keeping his cool was always the best approach. The flight attendant squinted at the screen, then at her seating chart. "And this is your first time in first class?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. A businessman across the aisle looked up, frowning slightly at her question. "No, it isn't," he answered simply, maintaining eye contact. He could have mentioned the hundreds of flights he'd taken while building his company, or the private jet he often used but had skipped today because he enjoyed flying commercial occasionally to stay connected with regular people. But he didn't. His mother had always told him that you never needed to prove yourself to people who had already decided what to think about you. The flight attendant's lips tightened into a thin line. "Well, let me explain how things work in first class," she began, speaking slowly as if talking to a child. "We have certain standards and expectations." An elderly woman 2 rows ahead turned around in her seat. "Excuse me," she interrupted, "but I'm having trouble with my reading light. Could you help?" Her voice was kind but firm, her eyes communicating that she had seen what was happening and didn't approve. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly torn between continuing her unnecessary explanation and attending to another passenger. Finally, she moved away, but not before giving him one last skeptical glance. As she helped the elderly passenger, he pulled out his tablet again, opening an email from his company's board about their latest sustainable energy project. The screen's glow illuminated the simple wedding ring on his finger, a plain gold band that had been his father's. His thoughts drifted to his dad, who had driven a city bus for 30 years and taught him that dignity wasn't about what other people thought of you, but what you knew about yourself. Other flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering pre-flight drinks to first-class passengers. They seemed to skip his row entirely, though he noticed they were quick to serve everyone else. A young flight attendant in training watched this happen, looking uncomfortable but unsure what to do. He pulled out his phone again, this time opening a photo of his daughter's science project. She was researching ocean pollution and its effects on marine life. Her passion for making the world better always reminded him why he'd started his tech company in the first place: to create positive change, not just make money. The plane began to push back from the gate. Outside his window, the morning sun was now fully up, casting long shadows across the tarmac. He knew this flight was about to become more interesting than he planned, but he also knew that how he handled the next few hours could make a real difference, not just for himself, but for others who might face similar situations in the future. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs had just turned off when things began to escalate. The businessman was feeling a bit thirsty after skipping his usual morning coffee due to the early flight. He noticed the flight attendant who had questioned him was now cheerfully serving drinks to other first-class passengers, chatting warmly with each one. When she reached his row, he politely raised his hand. "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water, please?" His voice was steady and professional, the same tone he used in board meetings with investors who doubted his vision years ago. The flight attendant barely glanced his way. "We're serving the front rows first," she said curtly. "You'll have to wait your turn." She then immediately turned to the passenger across the aisle, who had boarded after him, and asked with a bright smile, "Would you like something to drink, sir?" The contrast in treatment was so obvious that several nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks. The elderly woman from earlier shook her head disapprovingly, while a young professional a few seats away frowned and removed his headphones to pay closer attention to what was unfolding. He took a deep breath, remembering the conversations he'd had with his daughter about handling unfair situations. Just last week, they'd discussed how she dealt with people underestimating her in her science competitions. "Kill them with kindness," she'd said, laughing, "and then prove them wrong with your actions." The flight attendant continued down the aisle, serving drinks to everyone else in first class, somehow managing to skip his row entirely. A younger crew member watched this happen, clutching her serving tray nervously, clearly uncomfortable with what she was witnessing but unsure how to intervene. He pulled out his phone, quietly documenting the time and details of each interaction. Not out of spite, but because he knew that real change often required clear documentation. His company had grown successful partly because he learned to address problems systematically rather than emotionally. The businessman across the aisle, who had been watching the situation unfold, suddenly spoke up. "Hey, aren't you the guy who was just featured in that business magazine?" the one who's revolutionizing green energy technology. Before he could respond modestly, as was his habit, the passenger continued, now speaking loudly enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. Your company just donated millions to fund clean water projects in developing countries, right? My daughter did a school report about your work. The flight attendant, who was just passing by with a fresh round of drinks, stopped abruptly. The color drained from her face as she finally made the connection. Her hands trembled slightly as she realized she'd spent the last hour discriminating against one of the country's most successful tech entrepreneurs and philanthropists. But what she didn't know, what made her behavior even more ironic, was that just that morning, he had been reviewing plans for a new training program his foundation was developing. Its focus, teaching companies how to recognize and address unconscious bias in customer service. He remained silent, watching as realization dawned on her face. The water he'd requested still hadn't arrived, but he wasn't thinking about that anymore. Instead, he was considering how this moment could be turned into something constructive, not just for this flight attendant, but for the entire airline industry. The tension in the first-class cabin was now palpable. Other passengers were watching openly, some shaking their heads, others whispering among themselves. The young flight attendant in training had disappeared, presumably to speak with her supervisor. Change was coming, and everyone could feel it. Word spread through the first-class cabin like wildfire. The businessman watched quietly as passengers began pulling up his recent Forbes magazine cover on their phones. The cover story had highlighted not just his technological innovations, but his rise from humble beginnings and his commitment to making technology accessible to underserved communities. The flight attendant was now standing near the galley, having a hushed but intense conversation with the lead flight attendant. Her face showed a mix of emotions: embarrassment, fear, and the dawning realization of how badly she had misjudged the situation. A teenage girl sitting with her parents, a few rows ahead, turned around excitedly. "I did a school project about your clean energy initiative," she exclaimed. "Your company is working on making solar power affordable for everyone, right? That's so cool." He smiled warmly at her enthusiasm. "That's right," he replied. "We believe everyone deserves access to clean energy, regardless of where they live or their economic situation." His voice carried naturally through the cabin, not raised but clear enough for everyone, including the flight attendant, to hear. The businessman across the aisle leaned over. "I can't believe how calmly you're handling this," he said quietly. "I would have lost my temper an hour ago." "Getting angry rarely solves anything," he responded, thinking about all the times he'd faced similar situations before his success became public. What matters is turning these moments into opportunities for change. The lead flight attendant approached his seat, her expression professional but concerned. "Sir, I've been informed about what's happened, and I want to personally apologize. Would you be willing to speak with me privately about this situation?" He nodded, standing up to follow her to a more discreet area of the cabin. As he passed the still flustered flight attendant who had discriminated against him, he noticed she couldn't meet his eyes. Her hands were shaking slightly as she arranged drinks on her service card. In the galley area, the lead flight attendant spoke softly but firmly. "Sir, I want you to know that this behavior absolutely does not reflect our airline's values. We take these matters very seriously. How would you like us to handle this situation?" He thought carefully before responding. His mind went to the countless times he'd been underestimated or discriminated against before his success made him acceptable in certain people's eyes. He thought about other travelers who might face similar treatment but wouldn't have the protection of wealth or fame. "I don't want anyone to lose their job," he began thoughtfully. "What I'd like is for this to become a learning opportunity. My company has developed some excellent training programs about unconscious bias. Perhaps we could work together to implement something similar for your staff." The lead flight attendant's relief was visible, but so was her respect for his measured response. She began taking notes as he outlined his suggestions for turning this unfortunate incident into a catalyst for positive change. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, passengers were still discussing the situation in hushed tones. The elderly woman who had witnessed everything from the beginning was explaining to her seatmate how impressed she was by his handling of the situation. "That's real class," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "Anyone can get angry, but it takes real character to respond with dignity." The young flight attendant in training watched this exchange from nearby, absorbing an unexpected but valuable lesson about professionalism, prejudice, and the power of responding to discrimination with grace and purpose. After his conversation with the lead flight attendant, the businessman returned to his seat, noticing how the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. The other passengers watched him with a mixture of respect and curiosity, impressed by his calm handling of the situation. He pulled out his tablet, opening his email to document everything while it was still fresh in his mind. The young flight attendant in training approached his seat, carrying a tray with a fresh glass of water and some premium snacks. "I'm so sorry about earlier," she said softly. "Would you like anything else?" Her hands trembled slightly, but her sincere smile showed she was genuinely trying to make things right. "Thank you," he replied warmly, accepting the water. "You know, when I started my company, one of our core values was that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, from the janitor to the CEO. It's something I learned from my parents." He shared this not to boast, but to put the young attendant at ease and turn this into a teaching moment. The problematic flight attendant had been reassigned to economy class, and word of what happened had spread throughout the plane. Through the curtain dividing the cabins, he could see her avoiding eye contact with everyone, her earlier arrogance replaced by visible shame. The businessman across the aisle leaned over again. "My daughter would love to hear about your company's internship program. She's studying computer science and is passionate about green technology." He passed over his business card, and they began discussing the future of sustainable energy. Meanwhile, the lead flight attendant was busy making phone calls from the galley. He could hear fragments of conversations about immediate action and training protocols. His suggestion about implementing bias training seemed to be taking root already. As he sipped his water, he thought about his daughter again. Just last week, she had faced her own challenge with prejudice at a science competition. "Dad," she had told him, "I didn't want to win just to prove them wrong. I wanted to win to show other girls like me that they belonged there too." Her words had made him prouder than any business success ever had. The elderly woman who had witnessed everything made her way back from the restroom and paused at his row. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of years, "I've seen a lot of people face discrimination in my time, but I've rarely seen someone handle it with such grace. You're teaching more lessons today than you know." He thanked her, remembering his own grandmother who had always told him that true strength wasn't in showing power, but in knowing when to use it wisely. Looking around the cabin now, he could see that this incident, though unfortunate, was creating ripples of change. The lead flight attendant returned with an iPad, asking if he would be willing to provide a formal statement. "We want to use this as a case study in our training," she explained. "Your approach to this situation. It's exactly what we need our staff to learn from." As he began documenting his experience, he noticed the young flight attendant in training watching from a distance, taking notes in a small notebook. He realized that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most uncomfortable situations. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "It's not about what happens to you, it's about how you handle it that matters." As the flight continued, the impact of what had happened began to ripple through the entire aircraft. The businessmen noticed groups of flight attendants gathering in the galley, speaking in hushed tones and occasionally glancing his way. The original flight attendant who had discriminated against him was now quietly serving drinks in economy class, her earlier superiority replaced by visible humility. Through the cabin divider, he could see her hands shaking slightly as she served passengers. Despite everything, he felt no satisfaction in her discomfort. Instead, He recalled his early days building his company when a mentor had told him, "The true measure of leadership isn't how you treat people who can help you, but how you treat those who have wronged you." The lead flight attendant returned to his seat with an official airline complaint form. "Sir," she began, her voice professional but warm, "I want you to know that I've contacted our ground team in New York. The regional director will be meeting us at the gate. But first, I'd appreciate your thoughts on how we can prevent situations like this in the future." He put down his tablet, where he'd been reviewing plans for his company's new environmental project. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I believe every difficult situation offers an opportunity for growth. Instead of just filing a complaint, what if we work together to create something positive from this?" The businessman began outlining his ideas for a comprehensive training program. He explained how his tech company had successfully implemented similar initiatives, making sure to include everyone from entry-level employees to top executives. The lead flight attendant took detailed notes, her expression growing more interested with each suggestion. Meanwhile, the young flight attendant in training had been watching everything unfold. She approached hesitantly during a quiet moment. "Sir," she said softly, "I've been in training for 3 months, and I've learned more about professional behavior from watching you today than from any manual." He smiled warmly at her. "Sometimes the best lessons come from the most uncomfortable situations," he replied, remembering his daughter's words about her own experiences with prejudice. "The key is to focus on creating change rather than dwelling on the offense." The elderly passenger who had witnessed everything happened to pass by on her way to the restroom again. She paused, patting his hand. "You remind me of my late husband," she said with a gentle smile. "He always said that the best revenge is to succeed with dignity." As the flight began its descent into New York, the original flight attendant finally gathered her courage and approached him. Her face showed genuine remorse as she started to apologize. Instead of dismissing her, he listened carefully, noting how this difficult experience had already begun to change her perspective. "I've never been more ashamed of myself," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about how many times I might have done this before, making assumptions about people without even realizing it." He nodded thoughtfully. "Recognition is the first step toward change," he replied, thinking about his own journey and the many lessons he'd learned along the way. "What matters now is what you do with this awareness." The plane touched down in New York, and as passengers began gathering their belongings, he noticed something remarkable. The incident had created a sense of community among the passengers. People who had been strangers hours ago were now exchanging contact information, discussing discrimination, and sharing their own experiences. The story was far from over, but already it was transforming from an incident of discrimination into a catalyst for positive change. As he prepared to meet with the airline's regional director, he thought about how his response to this situation might influence how similar incidents would be handled in the future. As passengers started filing off the plane at JFK Airport, the businessman could see a small group of airline officials waiting at the gate. The regional director, a tall woman in her 50s with kind eyes, stepped forward immediately. Her face showed genuine concern rather than just corporate damage control. "Sir, we can't apologize enough for your experience today," she began, gesturing toward a quiet corner of the gate area. "Would you be willing to discuss this with us? We want to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." He noticed the other passengers watching as they passed by. The elderly woman who had witnessed everything paused to squeeze his arm supportively before heading to her connection. The businessman who had recognized him handed over his card, saying, "Please let me know how the airline responds to this. It matters to all of us." In the private gate area, the regional director didn't start with prepared statements or legal disclaimers. Instead, she asked him to share his experience in his own words. As he spoke, she took notes, asking thoughtful questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding the deeper issues. "You know," he said, pulling out his tablet, "I've been thinking about this during the flight. My company has developed some effective programs for addressing unconscious bias. Would you be interested in seeing how we've implemented them? The director's eyes lit up. Actually, she replied, that's exactly the kind of solution we're looking for. We've been discussing the need for better training programs, but having input from someone who's experienced discrimination firsthand would be invaluable. He opened a presentation about his company's diversity initiatives. The key, he explained, is making people understand that bias isn't just about obvious discrimination. It's about the small assumptions we make every day without realizing it. The young flight attendant in training had stayed behind to observe the meeting. She raised her hand hesitantly. During training, we focus a lot on service protocols, she said, but maybe we need more emphasis on examining our own prejudices. The businessman smiled encouragingly. Exactly. Real change starts with self-awareness. He thought about his daughter again, how she was growing up in a world that was slowly learning these lessons. Sometimes uncomfortable moments like today become the catalyst for meaningful change. The original flight attendant, who had been waiting quietly nearby, asked if she could speak. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were clear. I've learned more about myself in these few hours than in 15 years of flying, she admitted. I want to be part of making things better. The regional director turned to her. Perhaps you'd be willing to share your perspective once we develop the new training program. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from people who've recognized their own biases. As they discussed implementation plans, other airline staff gathered around, contributing ideas and sharing their own experiences. What had started as a single incident was transforming into a movement for change within the airline. The businessman checked his phone. His daughter had texted asking how his flight was. He smiled, thinking about how proud she would be of how this situation was being handled. You know, he said to the group, success isn't just about reaching the top. It's about sending the elevator back down to help others up. The meeting concluded with concrete plans for collaboration between his company's diversity team and the airline's training department. As he gathered his belongings to leave, the regional director asked one final question. Why did you choose to help us learn from this instead of just filing a complaint? He thought about all the people who had helped him along his journey, who had chosen to teach rather than condemn. Because, he replied, real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from understanding. 3 weeks after the flight incident, the airline's headquarters was buzzing with activity. The businessman sat in the conference room, watching as flight attendants from across the country filed in for the first session of the new training program. His company's diversity team had worked around the clock to create something meaningful, not just another corporate checkbox exercise. The flight attendant from his flight was there too, but she was different now. Gone was the arrogance that had led to the incident. Instead, she carried herself with a new awareness, ready to share her story as part of the training. She had volunteered to be one of the first speakers, turning her mistake into a powerful teaching moment. I thought I knew what good service meant, she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. But I didn't realize how my own biases were affecting my behavior until that day. The room fell silent as she shared her experience, describing how her assumptions had led her to discriminate against someone without even realizing it. The businessman watched from the back of the room, remembering his own journey. He thought about the countless times he'd been judged based on appearances before his success became public knowledge. But instead of letting those experiences embitter him, he used them to fuel his commitment to creating change. The young flight attendant in training from that day was also present. She had been promoted to lead the airline's new mentorship program, designed to help new staff recognize and address unconscious bias from their first day on the job. Sometimes the best teachers are our own mistakes, she told the group, glancing gratefully at the businessman. During the lunch break, crew members shared their own stories of times they'd either faced discrimination or realized they'd made unfair assumptions about passengers. The conversation was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always focused on growth and understanding. The regional director approached him with a thick folder. These are the preliminary results from our first round of training, she explained excitedly. Complaint rates are already down, and staff feedback has been incredibly positive. Your experience is helping us create real change. He opened the folder, finding letters from flight attendants who had gone through the program. One wrote about realizing she had been treating younger passengers differently without noticing it. Another described how the training had made him rethink his interactions with elderly travelers. The original flight attendant approached him during a quiet moment. "I've been sharing my story with every new training group," she said softly. "At first, it was humiliating to admit what I'd done. But then I realized that by being honest about my mistakes, I could help others avoid making the same ones." Looking around the room, he saw people from different backgrounds engaged in open, honest conversations about bias and respect. His phone buzzed. A message from his daughter asking how the training was going. He smiled, thinking about how proud she would be of the ripple effects from that difficult flight. The afternoon session began with small group discussions. The businessmen watched as flight crews tackled realistic scenarios, practicing how to recognize and address their own biases. The energy in the room was focused and positive, with everyone understanding that they were part of something important. "You've helped us create something special here," the regional director said as the day wound down. "This isn't just about avoiding discrimination. It's about building a culture of genuine respect." He nodded, remembering his mother's words about how change happens. "It's not about waiting for the perfect moment," she'd always said. "It's about making every moment count." 6 months after the incident, the businessman found himself back at the same airport, this time as a keynote speaker at the airline's corporate retreat. The large conference room was packed with staff from all levels, from ground crew to executive management. Looking out at the sea of faces, he could see how one difficult moment had sparked a movement for real change. The original flight attendant was sitting in the front row. She had been promoted to lead the airline's new passenger experience team, using her transformed perspective to help reshape company culture. Her story had become a powerful example of how people could grow from their mistakes. "When I walked onto that flight 6 months ago," he began his speech, "I never imagined it would lead to this moment. But sometimes life's hardest moments become our greatest opportunities for growth." The audience listened intently as he shared his perspective on that day and the changes that followed. The young flight attendant who had been in training that day was now conducting workshops herself. She had developed a special program for new hires, teaching them about bias through real-world examples and honest discussions. Her fresh approach had caught the attention of other airlines, who were beginning to adopt similar training methods. During the coffee break, crew members approached him with their own stories of change. One captain shared how the new training had helped him recognize his unconscious biases about female pilots. A ground crew supervisor explained how his team now handled cultural differences with greater understanding and respect. The regional director presented the latest statistics. Customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, discrimination complaints had dropped significantly, and staff morale had improved across the board. "Your experience changed more than just our training," she explained. "It changed how we see ourselves and our responsibility to our passengers." His daughter had come to watch his speech, sitting proudly in the audience. During the Q&A session, she raised her hand. "As someone who's watched my father face discrimination throughout his life," she said, "what gives you hope that things can really change?" He smiled at her question, remembering all their conversations about making the world better. "Hope comes from seeing people like everyone in this room," he answered, "who choose to learn and grow from their mistakes instead of defending them." The flight attendant who had discriminated against him then stood up to share her part of the story. There were tears in her eyes, but her voice was strong. "6 months ago, I was the problem," she admitted. "Today, I'm part of the solution." That's how change happens. One person at a time, one moment at a time. At the end of the retreat, the airline's CEO announced that their new training program would be shared with other airlines as an industry best practice. What had started as one uncomfortable incident was now helping to transform air travel for countless passengers. As the businessman packed up his presentation materials, he found a stack of thank you notes from attendees. One caught his eye. It was from a new flight attendant who wrote about how hearing the story during her training had completely changed her approach to passenger service. Walking through the terminal to catch his flight home, he noticed subtle changes from his last visit. Staff members were more attentive to all passengers, regardless of appearance. The atmosphere felt more inclusive, more welcoming. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. "Remember when you asked me why we had to be twice as good to get half as far? Now you're showing them how to make it better for everyone." He smiled, knowing that sometimes the best response to discrimination isn't anger or revenge, but creating positive change that lifts everyone up.